NASA is building a station around the moon. SpaceX says it wants to build a city on Mars. Those are not two versions of the same dream. They are two different answers to the oldest question in spaceflight. Is space a place to visit, or a place to live after Earth stops being enough? One future keeps humanity in orbit, close enough to come home. The other tries to make home irrelevant. And somewhere inside that difference is a decision that could define the next century of our species. For most of the space age, the logic seemed obvious. You do not begin with a city on another world. You begin with a room, a sealed volume, a machine that keeps pressure in, radiation out, and panic under control. NASA's own history of space stations says the mission was always threefold. Do research that benefits Earth, learn how to live in the hostile environment of space, and promote peace. That sounds measured, responsible, civilized. But it also reveals something profound. NASA's first instinct was never expansion. It was survival under supervision. And that raises the first uncomfortable question. If humanity has spent decades learning how to live off Earth, why are we still so close to it? Because low Earth orbit is not deep space, it is the shallow end of the cosmic ocean. A station above Earth is dangerous, yes, but it is still wrapped in the psychology of return. Cargo can arrive. Communications are immediate. The planet fills the window. A medical emergency is catastrophic, but not absolute. Mars is absolute. Mars turns delay into law, resupply into strategy, failure into inheritance. And this is the second thread running underneath the entire story. NASA's orbital stations were designed to teach humans how not to die away from Earth. SpaceX is pursuing an architecture that assumes death cannot be the final argument anymore. There is a third thread, and it is the strangest of all. The company talking about 1 million people on Mars is also part of NASA's own near-space future. On Gateway, NASA's lunar outpost, the agency says SpaceX will provide cargo under its deep space logistics contract. So the same era now contains an extraordinary contradiction. The institution that spent generations perfecting orbital footholds is working with the company trying to turn footholds into departure ramps. To understand why that matters, we have to go back to the moment when orbital stations were not a compromise, but the center of the dream itself. In the 1950s, Wernher von Braun imagined a station that did not look temporary at all. NASA's history describes it as a majestic wheel, 250 feet wide, orbiting 1,075 miles above Earth, rotating to create artificial gravity. It would house 80 men. It was part fortress, part laboratory, part declaration that humanity could industrialize the void. Experts around him predicted that this next long step in space could be built by 1967. Listen closely to that phrase, not the last step, the next one. Even at the beginning, the station was never meant to be the destination. It was meant to be the platform from which destinations became possible. So what changed? After Apollo, NASA asked exactly that. In 1969, as the moon landing approached, internal planning converged on a 12-person Earth-orbiting station by 1975. Then an even larger outpost for up to 100 people. The Space Task Group presented options to President Nixon that still sound almost surreal in their ambition. Earth-orbiting stations, a lunar orbiting station, a lunar base, and even a human mission to Mars before the end of the 20th century. Mars was not outside the planet, Mars was inside it from the beginning. But the same NASA history that records that ambition also records its collision with reality. Budget decline, political caution, the war in Southeast Asia, and a White House that decided the post-Apollo future was simply too grand, too expensive, too early. So history narrowed. Apollo 20 was cancelled. The Saturn V, that might have sent more crews outward, instead launched Skylab. And Skylab, in its own way, changed everything. NASA calls it America's first experimental space station, designed for long durations, with a mission to prove humans could live and work in space for extended periods. Three-man crews occupied it for a combined 171 days and 13 hours, carrying out nearly 300 scientific and technical experiments. One of the first crews had an additional assignment so raw it still feels cinematic now. Save Skylab. That is the emotional truth of every station ever built. They are not habitats in the science fiction sense. They are fragile arguments, held together by engineering discipline and human nerve. Then came the political resurrection of the station idea. On the 25th of January 1984, Ronald Reagan directed NASA to build a permanently inhabited Earth-orbiting space station within a decade. His language was unapologetically grand. Americans would be living and working in space for peaceful, economic, and scientific gain. The program became Space Station Freedom, and then Freedom was redesigned, and redesigned again. And in 1993, as post-Soviet Russia struggled and the Cold War order gave way to something more unstable, the United States invited Russia into the program. Freedom merged with Russian station heritage drawn from Salyut, Mir, and the planned Mir 2. The result was not merely an engineering structure, it was a geopolitical conversation. The station stopped being an American citadel in orbit and became the International Space Station. The outpost changed shape, but the deeper logic remained. Learn to stay in space longer than before, without yet committing to never coming back. And yet, running beneath all of this was a sentence older than NASA, older than Apollo, older even than the space age itself. Earth is the cradle of humanity, but one cannot live in a cradle forever. NASA quotes those words from Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, written in 1911. For more than a century, that line has haunted every station ever drawn, launched, cancelled, redesigned, or occupied. Because a cradle is safe. A cradle is necessary. A cradle is where life begins, but a cradle is also where growth becomes confinement if you stay too long. And this is where SpaceX enters the story not as an alien interruption, but as the most radical reading of that sentence ever attempted. Technically, NASA's station strategy and SpaceX's civilization strategy solve different equations. A station solves for duration. Can humans stay alive longer, work farther out, automate more, coordinate internationally, and learn what the body and mind become in environments they were never evolved to endure? Gateway follows that logic exactly. NASA describes it as a modular lunar orbiting outpost with a minimum 15-year lifespan, built to support lunar surface missions, science in lunar orbit, and human exploration further into the cosmos. HALO, its habitation module, is meant to let astronauts live and work hundreds of thousands of miles from Earth. Its software is designed to support autonomous operation. In other words, Gateway is a school of remoteness, but SpaceX is solving for scale. Its official mission language is brutally clear. Fully and rapidly reusable rockets are the pivotal breakthrough, because reusability is what could reduce the cost of space access by 100-fold. On its Mars page, the company says a self-sufficient city would require upwards of 1 million people and millions of tons of cargo delivered to the planet. Several thousand starships, it says, would eventually transfer crew and equipment during launch windows that open roughly every 26 months. That is not a station model. That is shipping, logistics, demography, infrastructure. The leap is psychological as much as technical. NASA's classic station architecture asks how a few people can survive away from Earth. SpaceX asks how many people can go so that Earth is no longer the single point of failure for civilization itself. And the hardware reveals the philosophy. A station tolerates inefficiency because permanence is local. You can assemble modules gradually, resupply often, repair incrementally. A civilization transport system cannot think that way. It has to move mass, and mass is destined. SpaceX says Starship is designed from the beginning to carry both crew and cargo to Earth orbit, the Moon, Mars, and beyond, while also using methane and oxygen that could be produced from Martian resources. That single idea changes the emotional meaning of the vehicle. It is no longer just a rocket. It becomes a bet that the people inside it will not simply visit another world, but participate in making the next launch possible from there. And once that becomes the mission, every weld, every tank, every landing burn stops being about exploration as spectacle and becomes about whether human absence from Earth can one day be normal. But humans do not live inside architecture alone. They live inside meaning. And orbital stations, for all their danger, have always offered one profound psychological mercy. Earth never disappears. From the ISS cupola, astronauts can look down and see the planet not as an abstraction, but as a luminous, breathing fact. Christina Koch described the overview effect in terms that cut past politics and into something almost biological. You see the thin blue line of the atmosphere, she said, and on Earth's dark side, even a thin green line. Then the realization hits. Every single person you know exists inside that fragile boundary, and everything beyond it is completely inhospitable. That perspective matters more than people realize. A station astronaut looks outward, yes, but also constantly back. The mission may be hard, but home remains visible. Retired astronaut T.J. Creamer said that every crew member he brought into the cupola for that first exposure cried. It is heart-stopping. It is soul-pounding. It is breathtaking. That is what stations do at their best. They turn survival into reverence. They make people fall in love with the thing they temporarily left. And that may be one reason orbital life has remained morally legible to the public. It is risky, but it still feels connected, still accountable to Earth. A Mars architecture changes that emotional geometry. SpaceX says the first human explorers on Mars will prepare landing surfaces, set up power generation, survey local resources, and build habitats for a permanent presence. Read that again slowly. They are not described as tourists, flags and footprints, heroes, or even merely scientists. They are advanced workers of continuity, builders of conditions that other people will inherit. And that means the first crews heading to Mars will carry a psychological burden no station crew has ever fully carried. Station astronauts endure isolation, Martian settlers would endure replacement. They would know, from the beginning, that success is measured not by the elegance of return, but by the credibility of staying. Former NASA astronaut Jack Fisher, reflecting on the overview effect, said he wanted to help humanity get a permanent foothold in the stars. That phrase is the bridge between NASA and SpaceX, not because the two think the same way, but because they feel the same pressure from opposite sides. NASA has spent decades proving humans can endure space in measured increments. SpaceX is trying to turn that endurance into migration. One preserves the species through caution, the other through dispersion. But here is the question both visions still have to answer. What happens to the human soul when the blue world in the window becomes a bright point too far away to comfort? So here is the payoff to the contradiction that opened this story. NASA planned orbital stations not because it lacked ambition, but because institutions that send humans into lethal environments must turn ambition into procedure. Stations are where risk is domesticated, where survival becomes routine enough to study, where diplomacy can be welded into a structure. NASA's own history frames stations as research springboards, schools for living in hostile space, and instruments of peace. Seen that way, Skylab, Freedom, the ISS, and Gateway are not timid. They are a civilization behaving responsibly under the pressure of mortality. SpaceX, by contrast, is acting on a different fear. Its Mars language is not organized around laboratory science or orbital continuity. It is organized around scale, permanence, and self-sufficiency. The company says Starship should enable self-growing bases on the Moon and an entire civilization on Mars. That wording matters. Civilization is not a mission profile. It is a claim about history. It means law, work, birth, repair, shortage, conflict, memory, and the possibility that children may one day treat Earth not as home, but as origin. That is why the idea hits so hard, because once civilization enters the sentence, space stops being a frontier and becomes a place where ordinary human life, with all its beauty and damage, might continue beyond the cradle. And suddenly, the two visions stop looking like rivals. They look like phases of the same species under different emotional rules. The station says, learn carefully. The city says, scale before it is too late. The station says, keep Earth in view. The city says, learn how to survive when Earth is only a memory. The station says, return. The city says, remain. The deepest revelation is not that NASA dreamed too small or that SpaceX dreams too big. It is that humanity may need both instincts at once, the discipline to build rooms in the void, and the audacity to imagine that one day those rooms connect into streets. And that is why the present moment feels so historically unstable. NASA's Gateway is a lunar station meant to prepare humans for deeper space. SpaceX is already woven into that architecture as a cargo provider, even while openly declaring a far more radical end state. The old logic and the new one are no longer separated by decades. They are overlapping now, in the same century. In some cases, in the same contract. That means the future may not arrive as a clean replacement of one philosophy by another. It may arrive as an uneasy braid. Governments building the cautious scaffolding of presence. Private systems trying to turn presence into population. So, the real difference between NASA's orbital stations and SpaceX's interplanetary civilization is not hardware. It is an emotional horizon. A station is built around the idea that humans can leave Earth for a while. A civilization is built around the idea that humans may have to leave it for good, or at least long enough that return stops being the center of meaning. One teaches us how to survive away from home. The other asks whether home itself can multiply. And if Tsiolkovsky was right, if Earth is a cradle and not a final address, then the station and the city are not separate chapters. They are the moment before and the moment after humanity realizes it has grown too large for a single world. But if you want the next question, the one that begins after all the speeches, renderings, and mission statements, here it is. What actually happens when the first humans try to land a fully loaded vehicle on Mars through an atmosphere thick enough to burn them and thin enough to fail them, carrying the first pieces of a world that does not yet exist? Because getting to another planet is not the climax, it is the quiet moment before the real danger starts. And that is next.